On September the 7th, 1940, 348 German bombers and more than 600 Messerschmitt fighters attacked London, leaving more than 400 dead and over 1,500 injured. When the bombs finally stopped falling the following morning, Londoners were sure they had experienced the worst of what World War II would bring to their doorstep. But for the next 57 nights, the carnage returned. The city's citizens were ordered to adhere to strict blackout regulations they had been practicing for nearly a year. All windows and doors were covered at night to prevent the escape of light. External lights like street lamps were turned off or dimmed, and all other lights, including handheld torches, were to be pointed downwards to the ground. The goal was to hinder the Germans' navigation and targeting by eliminating man-made lights on the ground. And while the measures may have made it more difficult for the bombers to find their mark, the dark streets of London created a perfect environment for violent crime to flourish. And one man in particular used the horror of the Blitz to further his evil agenda so effectively that he was dubbed the Blackout Ripper. On Monday, February 9th, 1942, an electrician named Harold Batchelor noticed a torch lying on the ground in the air raid shelter in Marylebone. As he moved closer to pick it up, Harold noticed a woman's pocketbook lying a few feet away. Then he saw the woman. She had clearly been in a severe struggle. Her clothes were torn, her face and neck were black and blue with bruising, and her shoes were scuffed with mortar. Her skirt had been pulled up over her hips, and her underwear was around her knees. It was unclear if the woman had been killed inside of the air raid shelter or dragged inside following her death, but what was clear was that the woman had been strangled. The Marylebone victim was quickly identified as Evelyn Margaret Hamilton, a 40-year-old pharmacist originally from Newcastle in the northeast of England. She was said to be a bright, intelligent woman who lacked confidence. She had never married, but was dedicated to her job. After the war had nearly bankrupted the chemist's shop in Essex, where she'd been working as a manager, Hamilton had found a new job in Grimsby. She was in London en route there when she met a gruesome end. She was last seen alive at the Maison Lyons corner house in Marble Arch just before midnight. A waitress remembered her drinking a glass of white wine. Investigators believed she had likely been walking back to her boarding house after her nightcap when she'd been attacked and killed in the early hours of the morning. Despite her disheveled appearance, investigators concluded that no sexual assault had occurred, and after studying the pattern of bruising on her body, Home Office pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury believed that the killer was left-handed. Chief Superintendent Frederick Cherrell, known within London as the Fingerprint Man, arrived at the crime scene with a magnifying glass in hand. Cherrell was something of a pioneer in the field of fingerprint forensics and was exceptionally skilled at identifying single prints. He initially suspected that Evelyn Hamilton had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong, since fingerprints were found on her pocketbook and £80 were missing from her wallet. But this theory was quickly thrown into doubt when a day later a second body was found, that of Evelyn Oatley. Originally from Yorkshire, Evelyn was drawn to London's nightlife and at one point worked as one of Soho's famous windmill girls. Years later, she found herself married to her second husband and living in Blackpool, but the lure of the capital once again proved too tempting, and she returned to London while her husband stayed in the northwest. On the morning of February 10th, 1942, 2 electric meter readers in Soho knocked on the door of her first-floor flat on Wardour Street, but no one answered. With the help of a woman who lived next door, they were able to open the door to the property to gain access. Inside, 34-year-old Evelyn Oakley was lying on her bed with what the two visitors first thought was a red scarf tied around her neck. But upon closer inspection, they realized that her neck had been cut. Appallingly, Oakley's killer had mutilated her. Curling tongs, a razor blade, a broken mirror, a can opener, and a torch had been used on her in a most disturbing and depraved way. The scene brought to mind those of the Ripper murders some 50-odd years prior. Initially, the murders of Evelyn Hamilton and Evelyn Oakley were so different that investigators never considered they were committed by the same person. While Hamilton was alone and passing through London, Oakley had lived in her Soho flat for 3 years. The married Oakley was working as a nightclub hostess. Since the start of the war, and with her husband away, she had begun soliciting sex work under the alias Letter Ward. Hamilton had been attacked seemingly at random on the street, while Oakley's killer had gained access to her apartment, presumably through invitation. Apart from minor cuts and scratches inflicted on her right breast and a longer one near her eyebrow, Hamilton had not been mutilated. But Oakley had been butchered with a series of cruel tools. Evelyn Oakley was seen outside a restaurant on Shaftesbury Avenue late in the evening on February 9th. 3 eyewitnesses reported seeing a young, clean-shaven, brown-haired airman approach her. At 11:40 p.m., Evelyn's neighbour saw her enter the stairwell that led up to her apartment, and she was accompanied by a man who matched the description given by the restaurant. Shortly after midnight, the neighbour was awoken by the sound of a wireless turned up loud enough to be heard through the walls. Unbeknownst to the neighbour, Oakley's attacker had turned up the sound to cover her screams. Heartbreakingly, Evelyn's friends would later state that she had begun soliciting sex work because she was afraid of sleeping alone during the London blackouts. Again, less than 24 hours later, the Blackout Ripper struck again. In the early morning hours of February the 11th, a 43-year-old sex worker named Margaret Florence Lowe was murdered in her flat in Gosfield Street, Marylebone. Lowe, who often worked under the alias of Pearl, had been a sex worker in her 20s, but things seemed to change for her when she married widower Frederick Lowe and started a family. However, when he died suddenly, she was forced to return to the streets to help pay her daughter's boarding school fees. Her body was discovered the afternoon of February 13th after neighbours noticed they hadn't seen her in a few days, and a parcel sat unclaimed outside of her door. Lowe, like Oakley, was found on her bed. Beneath the quilt, she had been mutilated. Again, the killer had left his tools at the crime scene. A knife, a razor, and a candle lay nearby the body. Margaret had been strangled with a silk stocking which had been left knotted beneath her jaw. Fingerprints on the killer's tools again revealed that the perpetrator was likely left-handed. But despite the presence of prints at all 3 crime scenes, Cheryl could not use them to find a suspect. At the time, print analysis was limited to comparing specific points in a reference collection of thousands of samples. None of Cheryl's records matched the prints collected from the 3 crime scenes, so all he knew was that their suspect had not been arrested before. He was entirely unknown to law enforcement and was still very much at large. And his spree wasn't over yet. On Thursday, February 12th, a sex worker named Catherine Mulcahy was approached by a clean-cut man who solicited her in Regent Street. Mulcahy agreed to take the man to her flat, and the two shared a taxi to Southwark Street. After they entered the flat, Mulcahy undressed while the man watched her with a strange smile. When the man moved to lay on top of her, he slammed his knees into her stomach and began to try to strangle her. Thankfully, Mulcahy had wisely kept her boots on and was able to kick him hard enough to break his grasp. As the woman ran screaming to her neighbour's flat, her attacker quickly redressed and followed her. He pushed more money into her hand and apologised, saying he'd had too much to drink. But in haste to leave, the man left something behind, a Royal Air Force webbing belt. With his bloodlust interrupted, the Ripper found another victim that same night. 32-year-old Doris Juanet was married but earned money through sex work while her husband was away. She took a clean-cut man to her ground floor flat in Bayswater. The next evening, Doris's husband returned home to find his wife's body laying across their bed. A silk stocking was knotted around her throat, and her abdomen, genitals, left breast, and thighs had been horrifically mutilated with a razor blade and knife. The following night, a young woman named Greta Hayward was enjoying a night at the Brasserie Universelle when an airman offered to buy her a drink. When the pair left together, the man became unpleasantly forward, and Hayward protested. In response, the man pushed her into a doorway and choked her, but his attack was interrupted by a delivery boy, and the perpetrator fled, leaving another clue behind. This time, it was a gas mask and a haversack with the number 525987 printed inside. The delivery boy turned the gas mask and haversack into police and gave a statement about what he'd witnessed. The Royal Air Force confirmed that the items belonged to an airman named Gordon Frederick Cummins. Cummins was a 28-year-old Royal Air Force serviceman who'd just earned a transfer to the Air Crew Receiving Centre in Regent's Park after accruing over 1,000 hours of flight experience and impressing the RAF selection board with his aviation exam scores. However, he was known to be an exaggerator and liar who was unpopular with his peers. Cummins was married to the secretary of a West End theatre producer named Marjorie Stevens, who lived at a flat they'd rented together in Southwark. The night of his first blackout killing, Cummins had borrowed £1 from his wife to spend a night on the town. Gordon was questioned and held on remand on the charge of causing grievous bodily harm to Greta Hayward. His living quarters were searched and investigators discovered items belonging to the victims of the recent London murders. A pen belonging to Doris Juanet, cigarette cases from Evelyn Oakley and Margaret Lowe, and even a photograph of Oakley's mother. Debris on Cummins' clothing matched the dust from the air raid shelter where Evelyn Hamilton's body had been found. And most importantly, Cheryl was able to match the man's fingerprints to the horrific tools of torture he'd used on his victims. Investigators were sure they had caught the man who was responsible for the 4 unthinkable murders in the same number of days. Gordon Cummins was tried for the murder of Evelyn Oakley in April 1942. He pled not guilty, insisting that another serviceman had stolen his belongings and then committed the murder. But it took just 35 minutes for the jury to find him guilty, and Cummins was sentenced to death by hanging. The sentence was carried out by renowned executioner Albert Pierpoint at Wandsworth Prison on June 25, 1942. And the Blackout Ripper swung from the gallows as a German air raid struck London. While Cummins was only tried and convicted of 1 murder, Scotland Yard was sure he'd committed all 4 Blackout Ripper crimes and thought he may be responsible for 2 other murders. In October 1941, A 19-year-old clerk named Maple Churchyard was found strangled to death in a bombed-out house on Hampstead Road. And 4 days later, 48-year-old widow Edith Humphreys was found in grave condition at her home. She'd been bludgeoned and strangled, and her throat had been slit. She died moments after arriving at the hospital. Shortly after these murders, Gordon Cummins was posted to Cornwall. He returned to London on February 2nd, 1942, 6 days before telling his wife he was off to enjoy a night in the West End. Given the carnage Cummins left behind in less than a week of curfews, dark streets and air raid sirens, it's chilling to imagine what the Blackout Ripper may have done if he had been left to prowl the darkness through the remainder of the Blitz. It's a chilling reminder that even as bombs fall during wars, there are always darker, even more sinister monsters in the shadows. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.